Streaming live. This is Tracking the Tropics.
Wednesday afternoon, everyone. Meteorologist Amanda Hawley here, of course, with our weekly Tracking the Tropics. We are back with our regularly scheduled programming, but we are tracking this week the remnants of Barry, and that is all the flooding that we saw in the lower Mississippi Valley. And of course, we've got our meteorologist joining us. We've got Lee Spann from WFLA. She's our morning meteorologist here in Tampa, and also our featured meteorologist, Bob Jeswald. He is the chief meteorologist at WRBL in Columbus, Georgia, and he's been there for 14 years. So lots going on, but of course we are streaming on apps, websites, and social media platforms all across the South. Of course, we're streaming live to cities in Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, as well as Texas. It is July 17th today, and we're going to be talking about Barry and a couple other storms. But yeah, let's jump right into it, guys. Let's talk about Barry. Let's talk about how it started. Bob, I don't know if you want to start off. It kind of started over you.
It did. I mean, I was talking to our meteorologists on staff too, because we're trying to think, hey, you know, from the Euro to the GFS, those two models, the global forecast solution was pretty darn good and spot on, that it knew it would become centered over that Gulf and in the north central Gulf of Mexico, and getting a nice warm low, which would develop into a tropical storm. Amazing how on point that was. But starting over land, it isn't too often you see this. And now, you know, back in early 2000, we had a lot of zigzagging over the peninsula of Florida, North Florida, that sort of thing. But to see the way Barry was developing as it came out of Tennessee, and you could see the track right there on your screen, as it came through metro Atlanta, is an area of low pressure. Now, I'll tell you, leading up to that, it had a lot of energy with it. So that was necessary for it to sustain its strength when it got into the open waters of the Gulf of Mexico, to then become that warm low that we look for to become centered and become a nice tropical feature, and cyclone in that case.
It was really interesting. I mean, knowing that low was going to hit water, and that Gulf water is now close to 90 degrees. And we knew when that low drifted south, and if it went back over those waters, it would have, it would gain tropical characteristics. And it was just such a slow mover. It was able to generate enough energy to even become a Category 1 hurricane.
Crazy.
Yeah, and it did briefly. But it took a long time for it to get organized. But I mean, organized or not, we always knew that this storm was going to be a flood maker, a rain maker, and it produced quite the rain and the flooding. We're still dealing with that, and this system hit last Saturday. It made landfall, and we're still dealing with flooding in the lower Mississippi Valley. So you can see here, it made landfall 2:00 Eastern time in Louisiana as a Category 1 hurricane, but quickly weakened as it slowly crawled north and sometimes jogged a little bit east and west there. But again, those rainfall totals were astronomical.
Yeah, it took almost 2 days to get out of Louisiana. And now these are the current conditions as of 11 o'clock this morning, Eastern time. It has 15 mile per hour sustained winds. It is obviously post-tropical. It's just interesting that we're still watching the low that started in Tennessee, drifted through Georgia, into the Gulf, made landfall as a Category 1 hurricane, and now we're still talking about some semblance of this thing holding together, bringing rain from New York all the way down, back into Tennessee, back into Alabama and Mississippi. Bobby, this is a long-lived area of low pressure.
It's crazy. It's Lee and Amanda, you were talking about it, how this flooding issue, because it's so slow moving, and for it to continue to have no disruption from upper level winds, which I know as we're in this kind of weak El Nino pattern, what's happening is that I think wind shear is certainly, and it is making it conducive for this thing to just keep surviving. It's not getting ripped apart. The 500 millibar layers, we start looking at mid layers of the atmosphere, was indicating, even a week before, that this thing would be a 990, or at least maybe a little less, which it never did as a Cat 1, but it is a 991 millibar low, was amazing and spot on for that. But it appears that the conditions continue to be favorable for that. And minus the wind shear, although you're still seeing, if you look up across Minneapolis, you get some of those little weak troughs coming down. And of course, if they can make it all the way to the mid-Atlantic, it kind of keeps these things offshore. So in this particular case, it just timed out just for that low to get into the northern Gulf of Mexico as it did, but it brought in severe storms over land where it basically got over the water. And leading up to that, as you saw the flooding in Louisiana, you guys were showing me earlier, the incredible amounts of water that started coming in Ragley and Oberlin and Marksville and Gillis, some of these cities that you guys have here, close to 2 feet, for crying out loud, and it was preceding the actual landfall. So there you go, and you have surge and high tide. It was unprecedented to see the timing of those events. In many cases, people were saying on the coastal areas that they've never seen anything like that since they've been around. I mean, the time.
And it was actually, as a meteorologist, you look at all the ingredients. Not always did the ingredients make the perfect cake. In this case, thank goodness it didn't. But knowing that the Mississippi River was already at some of the heights of the levees around around New Orleans, then there could have been a storm surge there. Then there could have been 2 feet of rain. I mean, I was looking at it thinking those were the 3 terrible ingredients that could have come together over New Orleans. Now, thankfully, it wasn't New Orleans that got the most rain, and those levees were not overtopped. But a lot of places just to the west of New Orleans did get that 15 to 20 inches of rain. And that, a low-lying area like that, most people who've been to the coast know that you're low to the ground. You're at sea level, and that water doesn't have anywhere to go.
Yeah, we'll be dealing with this flooding now for quite some time. I don't think some of those rivers were supposed to start to recede until Friday, and that's still 2 days from now. But the video that you're seeing on your screen here is flooding from Arkansas. We have several different areas, but yeah, just a lot of ponding on the roadways, and people have places to be.
And so, speaking of Arkansas, I know Amanda and I were talking about this, that a lot of times now, Bobby, you can't say that a tropical storm is just a coastal event. I mean, some of the areas in Arkansas had the flooding rain, had strong winds, and you're sort of there, the middle of Alabama, Georgia area, and a lot of times storms come through there, bringing rain, bringing sometimes even still tropical storm force winds to you.
Yeah, it's crazy. I can show you some of the course of just recently what we had. I'll let you guys go ahead, and if you want to lead me with whatever video, and I can talk around that so it coincides with that. But you could see Irma damage. This was Russell County, Georgia, and it really was in the Russell County, Alabama. And then you look in areas around Sumter County, trees were snapped. It was a heavy-duty wind event. Of course, roof damage from these trees toppling over, many power outages, and obviously the leaking roofs became an issue, as you can see here. This is Irma as it came through our southeast counties, and you can see the walls that are cracked, and the damage from these trees have been stressed. From 2007, we had a decade of drought, and then you get into the 500-year flood years in the mid-90s into the mid-2000s first, and then it kind of repeated itself from the 90s, and then we get all these stressed roots. So shallow root trees, we're a big pine state here. We got a lot of pines, and some, even this hardwoods, get to the point that 20 to 35 mile per hour winds sustain, like Irma here in Sumter County, Georgia, includes a big city of Americus. And I know you're from South Georgia, so you know what I'm talking about here. Just were uprooted. We had some isolated tornadoes, but a lot of this was just from sustained winds and saturated grounds in a very short period of time. It came in as a depression and then eventually came right here and right in the center of Columbus, Georgia, and it knocked power out of our rural counties that rely on wells, and that's their source of water, for over a week it took to restore power. And Irma was very pesky that way because it was slow moving. It was a heavy rain producer, and it was those sustained winds. And again, 25, a gust of 30, people would say that's innocuous, no big deal. But when that continues at that rate, you stress a tree, and you see the results there on your screen, just like Irma was here. Dennis in 05, look at the pumps we had to flood out. Dennis was just stalled out, and this was a nightmare for agriculturalists. We lost so much crops that year. We couldn't get the machine in there. Everything was spoiled. It became rotted, and you could see the outlying areas here that sustained so much damage in the millions. Obviously, it was declared a federal disaster area from the Dennis flooding that we had here, and it just couldn't recede because then there was another system after another with just afternoon pop-up convective storms that just added insult to injury from Dennis. And again, this is nothing new to inland. So you think of coastal areas, and certainly you guys have seen enough in your time, but it gets very worrisome because you're not only getting outer bands leading up to it, as it did with Barry last week for the coastal areas of Louisiana, but when it gets inland here, we get the wind, we get tornadoes sometimes, severe weather, as you mentioned, and then flooding from slow moving post-tropical system.
And I know I'm from South Georgia, a little bit to your east, and I sent my parents who are here in Florida to back home to where Hazelhurst, Georgia, during Irma, and they said it was as bad there as it was. I mean, that's southeast Georgia, as bad as it was anywhere in Florida. I mean, trees down for miles. I mean, again, like you're saying, it wasn't extremely strong winds. It was just that sort of consistent pouring rain and 30, 40 mile per hour wind gusts, and it brought down all these trees all across the county. And it's interesting that people forget about the inland flooding and the tornado risk for inland areas. And that's kind of why we wanted to talk more about this, because Barry did this, Irma did it, Dennis did it. It's everyone who can hear us now, who's actually been who we're streaming to, needs to think about tropical systems, not just people right along the coastline.
Yeah, normally with tropical systems too, we usually see deeper moisture, so we're seeing those heavier rainfall, totals and amounts as the storm progresses. And of course, it all depends on how fast the storm is moving as well. With last year, the year before that, this year, we've had some very slow moving storms, and that only makes the problem a lot worse.
Amanda was up in Myrtle Beach when Florence came on shore, so she dealt with flooding for a week. I mean, with the storm itself sitting on top of
Right.
the Carolinas for a week. So every storm is different. If that's one thing that we can drive home, we're looking at a map of the historic Irma. It came on shore, on the mainland of the peninsula of Florida as a Category 1 hurricane, but then came up and still was a tropical storm close to where Bob is there in the western, southwestern portion of Georgia. So everyone needs to be aware that every storm is different. Some storms immediately weaken when they come on shore. Some are fast moving, some are slow moving. Some bring more rain and tornadoes in places away from the coast than they do when they come on shore. So when we talk about tracking the tropics, and we stream this on all these different platforms and all these different counties and all these different viewing areas, everybody can be affected by these storms.
Absolutely. It's interesting. I told you guys before we had this the other day, just by chance, I had the Inspector General. He's with the reserves, Army Reserves, here at Fort Benning. That's the post that's right next to us. And when he told me, I'm like, wow, you're doing that. I said, he goes, yeah, I'm PCSing. And in military terms, he's actually getting another assignment to Louisiana. And he said, Bob, I would have been working around the clock. He goes, but I've been in touch with the reserves over there about Barry. And I said, tell me about Barry, because I didn't understand. I said, look, you look at, 4, major hurricanes that were Cat 5s in the history since 1850 that made it, of course, landfall, from the Labor Day of 35-69 Camille in New Orleans, and 92 Andrew, and then, of course, Michael of last year. Now, Category 5, it wasn't considered that, but as I went back and checked out the data, we realized this was a Cat 5 making landfall. But he said it's really the rate of rainfall with those pumps, because anyone who knows this, or somebody who's younger, didn't understand those levees in the 60s, were designed for Category 3 strength. And we showed Pass Christiana in there, but Pass Christiana got wiped off on the right quadrant of that. It was the flooding again. I said, well, okay, so what made Barry any different? Why are we seeing the flooding then? I mean, this is nothing like Katrina. And he says, Bob, it'll still just a half an inch an hour. You get above that, he goes, the pumps are cranking up, and you start going an inch an hour, which we had preceding with those outer bands, and you stressed it. You said each storm is different, and by golly, it is. They bring different threats, and we learn something different each time. He said that's how much those pumps could sustain. So then you start looking at the politics of this. You start looking at, what do we got to do to add more money and revenue and resources to bring better pumps in a subsea level environment? But, I don't think it's going to change. I mean, they are still in a situation where, what about the next one that comes in and it just times out perfectly? The pumps are only pumping so much per hour, and you start seeing rates of rainfall that are exceeding that. You're flooding, period. No question about it.
We've seen the cross section of what New Orleans looks like. It is literally a bowl. They've built up sides that hold back water on all sides. And I said, when I was looking at the ingredients, if they all had come together in the right way, that bowl would have filled up. And so we're glad that it didn't. But as you mentioned, something needs to be done with it for sure. And that's why hurricanes get categories now simply based on the maximum sustained wind. Every storm, you'll have to listen to your local emergency managers, your local meteorologists, because those are the ones that can tell you, is this a rain event? Is this a wind event? Is this going to flood? What areas are going to flood? Because just listening to the fact that it's a tropical storm, category 4, whatever it is only telling you that one small element. And everything else, all the different elements with storm surge and tornadoes and flooding, that's all going to come from the individual storm. And that's what a value that people in your local community, your local meteorologist, your local emergency managers, that's who you need to be listening to when the time comes.
Yeah, because that combination of events is going to be different for each area, whether you're on the right side of the storm, the left side of the storm. You're going to have a different combination of hazards. And sometimes, obviously, some storms are less impactful than others. But I think kind of the one good thing that we have seen with the past 3 years being so active, it gets people back in the mindset to see what, these storms can do. And hopefully, whoever's watching out there, you're being prepared a little bit more than you were, after the lack of storms we had for a decade.
I haven't seen too much. I was looking at, the outer bands on Sunday. We had like nothing going on. And I captured this. I don't know if you guys can see this or not. I'm going to try to put it up here. This is out of my back window of my house. And again, the rain is just torrential rain. This came literally with one of the outer bands. And you can see it on your tropical satellite when it was coming through over Sunday. Got some plants that got watered there. But it's hard to see on there. But it's 45 mile per hour winds just came out of nowhere, snapped some trees, and we had some loss of power. And that's really one of the impacts, too. I mean, it looked like there was nothing. The day went well. It seemed out of nowhere, but a band just sustained. And then you start saying to yourself, how could we still be getting some of this residual effects from this? And you can. A lot of people were acting like they're caught off guard. And you can be. But whenever there's a tropical system hundreds of miles away, it's how do you get that information? What we're doing here, we're tracking the tropics to make sure that everybody is always being tapped in. Keeping your FLA radar app, your WRBL radar app right there on your mobile device, because within a 250 nautical mile, there's impacts now. I mean, and they're a little bit more intense, and the durations are longer now. Not like we've seen before. You get a tropical system, it's there, it dissipates. They just they sustain, and they keep on going. And then you got to start talking about the ecology a little bit. What's going on across the coast with these algae plumes, and people getting ill all the way across the Florida Panhandle to Orange Beach, Mobile, Mississippi, even into Texas.
Yeah, I know that they were talking about that with the Mississippi River outflowing all of this fresh water a lot more than it normally does. How's it going to affect that? I think they're continuously looking into that, because that's going to be big here over the next couple of weeks. I know with Florence, when I was tracking Florence last year in North and South Carolina, we got almost 3 feet of rainfall in some spots, but that was at one time, or at least over the course of 3 days. But the impacts were being felt. That water stuck around for 3 weeks. We were tracking the flooding and all the rain. The rain falls over a big area, but then it all drains back into those small rivers and creeks, or in this case, the Mississippi River, which is large. But either way, everything's draining into it slowly. So you still deal with those impacts, for weeks to come after, these storms move through.
And that's what we're dealing right now with Barry. We're still watching, the rivers, still, but they haven't crested yet. They'll slowly be going down. And, Bob, I really appreciate you giving your perspective of being such a far inland community and still having these effects. So we want everyone to be, aware that hurricane season goes right through November 30th. We've only had 2 named storms. We hope that we don't have any more, but we also know that's probably not very likely. So we when there's nothing going on in the tropics, we have these tracking the tropics weekly every Wednesday. But as you saw with Barry, we zip those up whenever there's more going on and affecting more people.
Yeah, and luckily the tropics are quiet right now, not expecting any development over the next 5 days, right? We all like to hear those words. So hopefully, the South will get a chance to dry out over the next few days while Barry pulls away and pulls a lot of that deeper tropical moisture with it. But like Lee said, we are going to be doing this every week, storm or not, and giving you an update on what we are tracking, because there's always something to track. And of course, that is right here on Tracking the Tropics, whatever app, website, or social media platform you are watching from. You can catch us next week again, 1:30 Central, 1:30 Eastern, 12:30 Central. But until then, we hope you guys stay safe, and hopefully the southeast dries out. Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for watching Tracking the Tropics.